Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating this round table. And as far as I could see this morning in the short briefing we had after the main speeches, I think it's going to be a really interesting round table. We have James Dorsey from Singapore and Jason Pak from Cambridge. We are going to deal with how can we improve the situation in the Arab world, precisely in the question of the conflict in Syria and Iraq, in Libya and in Yemen. And so I guess it's going to be a really fruitful roundtable. As I have to moderate this roundtable, I begged from our speakers to use no more than 20-25 minutes each, and then in that case we may have time enough to discuss afterwards. So please, James, it's your turn.
Just cut me off.
Thank you.
Es un placer y un honor estar aquí en Sevilla y también en esta conferencia. Me disculpe, pero mis palabras son en inglés porque mi español está muy pasivo. The short answer to the question framing this session is, where does one start? If things were not complicated enough, answering the question has become even more difficult with the rise of Donald Trump and the fact that no one, maybe not even he, has an idea what his policy is going to be towards the various crises in the Middle East and North Africa, or what his attitude might be towards various countries in the region. So rather than speculate or get bogged down in the excruciating detail of individual conflicts like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or Libya, what I would like to do is look at fundamental issues that weave themselves like a red thread through whatever conflict or crisis we are looking at. And these include the ones named in the title of this session, as well as the phenomenon of militant political Islam, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Saudi-Iranian struggle for regional, if not global, hegemony in the Muslim world. Many blame the disintegration of post-colonial nation-states like Syria, like Iraq, like Libya, and like Yemen on the drawing of artificial borders by colonial powers, as symbolized by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. If that were true, we would see a similar development across Africa. For much of the second half of the 20th century, many feared that any secession would have a domino effect across the African continent. That was the concern with Biafra in the 1960s, and with the recognition by the Organization of African Unity of the Frente Polisario, the Algerian-backed liberation movement of the Western Sahara in the 1980s, and the independence of Eritrea in 1991, after a 27-year-long guerrilla war. Both of these incidents remain isolated incidents. You do not have the domino effect. So Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen are falling apart, not because they are artificial constructs created by colonial powers, but because they were ruled by autocratic governments who were exclusive rather than inclusive. That is to say, significant segments of the population, often defined in religious or ethnic terms, had no real stake in the state or in society. In fact, that is the state of affairs across much of the Middle East and North Africa. Think of Palestinians, Kurds, Shiites, Christians, just to name a few. Radicalization, moreover, is fueled by misguided foreign policies, as well as repressive, exclusionary domestic strategies that produce social marginalization, huge gaps in income distribution, and dislocation of resources in corrupt autocracies with youth bulges that populate a swath of land stretching from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Indian Ocean. If this sounds familiar, widespread discontent in the Middle East and North Africa is indeed part of a global trend, albeit perhaps its most brutal and violent expression. One reason for this is that the Middle East and North Africa are populated by regimes that have a demonstrated willingness to defend the essence of the status quo at whatever price. That price can be the destruction of whole countries, as in Syria and Yemen. These regimes see their survival in the shaping of the region in their own mold and do not shy away from stoking conflict and aiming for regime change when and where it suits their interest. External powers, like the Soviet Union in the past and Russia today, as well as the United States, were actively or passively supporting policies of the regional allies. As a result, no Middle Eastern or North African state or external power emerges from this smelling like a rose. In the days of the Cold War, it was the Soviet-backed revolutionary regimes like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Algeria versus primarily monarchical conservatives. Post-Soviet Union, ideology has made place for pure power plays. The one exception to this rule is the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, one of the 20th century's few truly popular revolts. The Iranian Revolution challenged the region's existing order before and after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. It represents an existential threat to the conservatives, and particularly to Saudi Arabia's ruling Al Saud family. The challenge is multifold. A republic rather than a monarchy, established as a result of a truly popular revolt that toppled a monarch and an icon of US power in the region. Adding fuel to the fire, Iran's republican version of an Islamic government is legitimized by an institutionalized, albeit flawed, electoral process and a degree of popular sovereignty that pays lip service to revolutionary goals. The Saudis were quick to recognize the existential challenge posed by Iran's Islamic Revolution. They decided early on that they had no choice but to confront it aggressively, both regionally and globally. If any one conflict has shaped the Middle East and North Africa, its various conflicts and multiple crises, as well as the fate of Muslim majority countries beyond the region and Muslim minority communities elsewhere, it is the epic struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran for regional hegemony as well as dominance in the Muslim world. This is not to deny the fact that national governments and non-state actors were and are important actors in the Saudi soft power ploy. The result of this confluence of interests has been devastating. It includes wars like the one between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s that left up to 1 million people dead. The devastation of countries like Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan that are racked by violence in which sectarian conflict was fueled by both parties, and the spread of religious, inward-looking, intolerant, and supremacist ultra-conservatism that offers the discontent and disenfranchised a refuge and creates an environment that in given circumstances serves as a breeding ground for religiously packaged militancy. Iran's revolutionary zeal, despite the emergence of Hezbollah as a potent transnational Shia militia force, past Iranian support of Hamas in Gaza, and the Islamic Republic's opportunistic alliance with the Houthis in Yemen, petered out in all but word in the first year of the revolution. The Iraqi war against Iran, funded largely by Saudi Arabia and to a lesser extent the Gulf states, smaller Gulf states, gave rise to Iranian nationalism. Iran fought its proxy battles with the Saudis, primarily in the region itself. For Iran, it was a battle about power and a struggle against an inherently discriminatory ideology that targeted its interpretation of the faith. For the Saudis, it was one that was ultimately existential and about survival. It was not simply regional for the Al Sauds, it was global, giving the kingdom's claim to leadership of the Muslim world based on its custody of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the Al Saud's power-sharing agreement with the ultra-conservative clergy, ideologically committed to spreading its interpretation of the faith. The Saudi determination to counter the Iranian revolutionary threat by defeating rather than containing the Islamic Republic and towards Shiites That was what the Saudis were determined to do. To be sure, Iran repeatedly took the bait with the creation of Hezbollah, political protests during the Hajj in Mecca, the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, just to name a few of the incidents. Saudi Arabia's response to Iran's revolutionary appeal was to make an ultra-conservative worldview that emphasized denunciation of Muslim others like the Shiites, Ahmadis, and Sufis, as well as a supremacist worldview and arch-conservative family values, an influential player in Muslim communities across the globe. The Saudi effort produced the single largest dedicated public diplomacy campaign in history. Estimates of Saudi spending on the funding of Muslim cultural, religious, and educational institutions across the globe range from $75 to $100 billion. By comparison, the Soviet Union is estimated to have spent over a period of 70 years, $7 billion. This figure does not include the cost of forging close ties to non-Wahhabi religious and political leaders, militaries, and intelligence agencies in various Muslim nations in a bid to ensure that they bought into the geopolitical elements of Saudi-backed ultra-conservatism, first and foremost among which anti-Shiism. It also does not take into account expenditure on armed groups in Syria, Iraq, Bosnia, or Pakistan, where Saudi Arabia has funded militant, violent, and rabidly anti-Shiite and anti-Ahmadi groups responsible for the death of thousands. It also does not include the financial cost of Saudi backing of the US-led anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan, with its devastating consequences for both Afghanistan itself and Pakistan. On one level, the Saudi campaign has been phenomenally successful. Saudi-backed ultra-conservatism in whatever form, ranging from Wahhabism to various strands of Salafism to Deobandism, has been embedded in Muslim communities across the world and is an influential political player in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as countries as far-flung as Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Mali, and minority communities in Western Europe. Let me illustrate this with an anecdote. The man who was until recently deputy head of Indonesian intelligence and deputy head of Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the world's largest Islamic movements that professes to be anti-Wahhabi, is a fluent Arabic speaker. He spent 12 years in the Middle East representing Indonesian intelligence, 8 of those in Saudi Arabia. This is a man who professes in the same breath his dislike of the Wahhabis, and at the same time warns that Shiites, who constitute 1.2% of Indonesia's population, and that includes an estimated 2 million converts over a period of 40 years, he views them as one of the foremost domestic threats to Indonesian national security. This man is not instinctively anti-Shiite, but sees Shiites as an Iranian fifth wheel. The impact of Saudi funding is such that Nahdlatul Ulama, despite its history, is forced to adopt ultra-conservative language and concepts when it comes to perceptions of the threat posed both by Iran and the Shiites. Yet, 40 years since the Saudi soft power grab moved into full gear, its success has become as much a liability as it is an asset for the kingdom. As the kingdom moves into the firing line against the backdrop of demands that it live up to its responsibility for creating potential breeding grounds for radicalism and devastating whole countries, as with the Saudi military intervention in Yemen. The problem is compounded by the fact that the Al Sauds were not always in full control of the use of the monies they invested in their campaign. As a result, they have let a genie out of the bottle that now leads an independent life, has in part turned on the Saudis themselves, and that can't be put back into the bottle. The Saudi-Iranian battle is further accentuated by uncertainty over US policy. That is certainly true with the rise of Trump, who from an Iranian perspective has made comments that spark concern in Tehran, as well as remarks that could hearten the Iranians. Saudi uncertainty predates the rise of Trump. US officials, for much of their country's relationship with Saudi Arabia, have insisted that the two countries do not share common values, that their relationship is based on common interests. Underlying the now cooler relations between Washington and Riyadh is the fact that those interests are diverging. The divergence became evident with the eruption of popular revolts in 2011, and particularly US criticism of the Saudi military intervention in Bahrain to squash a rebellion, as well as hesitant American support for the toppling of Egyptian President Mubarak. It is also obvious in the nuclear agreement with Iran that is returning the Islamic Republic to the international fold, despite deep-felt Saudi objections. The result of all of this has been, with the rise of the Salmans, King Salman and his powerful son, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a far more assertive foreign and military policy. Make, however, no mistake. Saudi Arabia's new assertiveness is not a declaration of independence from the United States. On the contrary, Mohammed bin Salman has made that clear in various interviews. It was designed, certainly in the era of Obama, to force the United States to re-engage in the Middle East, in the belief that it will constitute a return to the status quo ante quo, US support for the kingdom as the best guarantor of regional stability. The Salmans were operating on the basis of Marxist Verelendungstheory. Things have to get worse to get better. It is a strategy that may or may not work with Trump. The Saudi strategy, with its pervasive impact on the Middle East and the Muslim world at large, long made perfect sense. Saudi regional leadership amounted to exploitation of a window of opportunity, rather than reliance on assets and power needed to sustain it. Saudi Arabia's interest is and was to extend its window of opportunity for as long as possible. That window of opportunity exists as long as the obvious regional powers, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt, are in various degrees of disrepair. Punitive international sanctions and international isolation long took care of Iran. Ironically, Trump could well extend the window if he adopts a hard line towards Iran. That is, for the Saudis, nonetheless, a double-edged sword. Saudi policymakers have come to see restrictions on Iranian nuclear policy, even if they are only for a period of 15 years, as an asset. The problem for the Saudis is that Trump at times has also suggested a harder US approach towards the kingdom itself. A concern for the Saudis that is more fundamental than uncertainty over US policy in the era of Trump is that Iran, despite not being an Arab nation and maintaining a sense of Persian superiority, has the assets Saudi Arabia lacks to secure its position on a level playing field as a regional power rather than a second fiddle state. Those assets, no matter how degraded, include a large population base, an industrial base, resources, a battle-hardened military, a deep-rooted culture and sense of identity, a history of empire, and geography that make it a crossroads. Just look at where the One Belt, One Road from China leads. It goes through Iran, not through Saudi Arabia. Mecca and Medina will not be able to compete, or Mecca and money will not be able to compete, and certainly not with religious ultra-conservatism playing a key influential role. Saudi Arabia was shell-shocked on September 11, 2001, when it became evident that the majority of the perpetrators were Saudi nationals. Saudi society was put under the kind of scrutiny the kingdom had never experienced before. The same is happening again today, with the rise of jihadism, the war in Yemen, and the kingdom's role in Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. Changing international attitudes towards Saudi sectarianism and its proxy wars against Iran are evident in a quiet conclusion in Western intelligence and policy circles that the crisis in Syria is in part a product of the international community's indulgence of Saudi propagation of ultra-conservatism. CIA Director John Brennan, unsuccessfully tried in 2011 as peaceful anti-regime protests in Syria descended into violence, to persuade Saudi Arabia at a meeting of Middle Eastern intelligence chiefs in Washington to stop supporting Sunni Muslim militants in Syria. An advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff recounted that the Saudis ignored Brennan's request. In his words, they went back home and increased their efforts with the extremists and asked us for more technical support. And we said, okay. And so it turns out that we ended up reinforcing the extremists. In sum, if inclusion rather than exclusion is the fundamental answer to the Middle East and North Africa's multiple conflicts, countering Saudi-backed ultra-conservatism is one major key to breaking the vicious cycle. That is obviously easier said than done, and only part of any successful effort. Islamic ultra-conservatism is often no longer dependent on Saudi funding, and has made such deep inroads into societies as well as governments, as for example in Pakistan, that it would likely take a generation to turn around. Saudi Arabia's soft power campaign has also sprouted radical groups that see the Saudis no longer as an inspiration, but as corrupt deviants to a fundamentally common interpretation of the faith. As a result, Saudi Arabia is both part of the problem and part of the solution. All of this leaves me where I began my remarks. Where does one start in assessing what can be improved in the Middle East and North Africa? Saudi Arabia is certainly not the only place, but it is one that, together with Iran, has its fingers in the region's key pies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dorsey. Thanks a lot for this overarching presentation about the multifold challenges in the MENA region. And now it's the turn for Jason Pack.
Good afternoon, all. I won't even attempt to greet you in Spanish other than to say buenos tardes. It's a real honor to be invited to speak at the Three Cultures Forum. Having grown up as a monolingual American, I likely would have stayed that way, except for a few coincidences which have brought me to spend 8 of the last 15 years in the Mediterranean basin. And during my travels in this region, I've learned Arabic, French, a bit of Hebrew, unfortunately no Spanish, but I've immersed myself in the life of more than 10 countries in this Mare Nostrum that we've been discussing. Along the way, of course, I've fallen in love with the rich cultures. And I've often reflected on how the role of cultural and social change in the Middle East over the course of the last 2 centuries has been stimulated by trade, empire, world wars, globalization, technological change, and of course ensuing political upheaval, that this cultural component is overlooked. So, although I'm going to be speaking about ISIS today, I'm going to try to interject something of a cultural and broader perspective rather than the traditional counter-terror narrative that one usually hears when the topic is jihadis. Despite that pragmatism, and being more of a pragmatic and a practitioner more than an academic, I'll still use the nerdy academic habit of changing my title subtly when writing the talk. So I now prefer From Gaddafi to Statelessness, the origins, expansion, and culture of the Islamic State in Libya. So with that lighthearted preface aside, we can get into the bone-chilling topic of ISIS in Libya. Sad as it is to admit, ISIS is a cultural product. It stems from the insular culture of the Salafi jihadi resistance, on the one hand funded and exported by the Saudis, and on the other hand a natural evolution of the resistance and opposition to the ideological Arab nationalist regime over the many decades. And so that's one component of ISIS's kind of cultural product. And that has a narrow base. It's coupled with a far more broadly felt nostalgia and desire for governance that pervades many Arab societies. The vast majority of scholarship on the subject, I feel, doesn't connect those two components because it takes this tactical military counter-terror perspective. Maybe a cultural approach would be something that could yield more insights as grad students and researchers look at how we got to this place in the Middle East right now. Over the past year, I've created a web monitoring service called Eye on ISIS in Libya, which tracks the actions and pronouncements of the Islamic State in Libya, as well as Western responses to those developments, the actions of other jihadi militias, and the ongoing flawed attempts to build a coalition of Libyan actors to confront ISIS. My Eye on ISIS team have recently published something called Who Pays for ISIS in Libya? And I have a forthcoming briefing paper with the Brookings Institution about the history and origins of the ISIS threat and how we might seek to eliminate it. This talk derives from both. So, with that background, I'll tell you about the structure. I'm going to start by first sketching the roots of the narrow milieu of Salafi jihadism in Libya, then moving on to explain the unique origins, expansions, and trajectory of ISIS in Libya. Lastly, I'll conclude by presenting some of the big picture policy and cultural findings of my Eye on ISIS team. So, in addition to giving a history of ISIS and its precursors in Libya, this talk will attempt to highlight the cultural and socio-political dimensions of the phenomenon. And in a way, hopefully that will address the question of the panel. What does that tell us about how Libyans need to draw cultural lessons, and by analogy, all Middle Eastern societies in their quest to deal with the threats of radicalization? So as you may know, and by the way, this feels very precarious, I'm near the edge here, sorry about that. Libya consists of 3 widely disparate regions, each characterized by dissimilarities in dialect, cuisine, topography, external alliances. I'm not using any maps, but hopefully I can paint a picture for you with words. Tripolitania in the northwest of Libya has always been more tied to the Maghreb and the Mediterranean through culture and trading patterns. The Fezzan in the southwest has been linked to the Sahara and Sahelian Africa, and Cyrenaica in the east has more links particularly with the Middle East and Egypt. One thing that you need to keep in mind about Libya is it's really the only Arab country that dialectically has a foot in both the Maghreb and Mashreq camp, right? It contains the 2 major, almost mutually unintelligible dialect groups within it. And as one studies the history of these far-flung regions, he discovers that the varying locales tend to share something. What they share is a legacy of Sufi Islam and the dominance of the rural or socially conservative ethos. And that has led to a historical distrust of central authority, be it Ottoman, Italian, or Libyan, either in its Gaddafian or now democratically or quasi-democratically elected versions. So conceived in this way against the larger backdrop of the Arab world, Libya appears like Afghanistan or Yemen, another country in which culture and history of peripheral actors don't allow them to accept a subordinate position, even to a political center that they see as sovereign or legitimate. However, Libya's uniqueness is that it might be the only example of an Arab oil country where the periphery remains dominant. And this is the exception that proves the rule, because the requirement of the extractive industries and the hydrocarbon sector in general is centralization, as we have in all the Gulf monarchies. Libya's very fragmentation and atomization is intrinsic in it. And I believe that this is what is culturally relevant to our story, the Libyans, as it were, psychological distrust for any center or aggregation of power. So, crudely put, as I was in the plane over here, I'm like, well, I guess that means the Libyans have a collective psychosis about government. They hate it fundamentally, but they know that they need it. Sounds a lot like the Republicans in my own country. So Libyans love to despise government as corrupt, venal, inefficient, inherently evil, yet they simultaneously wish to capture that very government and to use its power to benefit their localities and enact their agenda. Sounds pretty familiar, right? It's just like those benighted corners of the Rust Belt. And we can picture those areas in Libya where the government is paradoxically the least present. That's where locals crave services and they crave the order that state structures might provide. And yet, it's those exact areas, whether it's the Rust Belt or in Fezzan, where people distrust those who don't look like them and talk like them, and therefore are willing to reject the services of the very central government that could provide those things that they crave. Quite a paradox. As a result of these dynamics, Libya has traditionally occupied a unique position on the global jihadi circuit. in large part because Gaddafi-era repression and statelessness inspired homegrown jihadism. The Salafi current that was exported from Saudi Arabia that we heard about in James's fascinating and far-reaching talk is not indigenous to Libya. That's what I'm trying to point out. We can really trace its roots to the 1980s, when many Libyans took up arms and joined the Afghani Mujahideen. And since that point, Libyans in general, and Cyrenaicans in particular, have been vastly overrepresented in the world's jihadi hotspots. Nonetheless, their motivations for fighting have differed from those of their peers. They've generally not ascribed to the same extreme interpretation of Islam, whether it be a kind of Hanbali, Salafi jihadi view that their Saudi counterparts have tried to spread throughout the region. Instead, the Libyan motivation has always tended to stem from local political grievances, be they in Darna or Benghazi. And jihad was merely the tool to transform the local political context, such as trying to overthrow Gaddafi. This is well illustrated by the fact that the only serious moment when Gaddafi was on the verge of being overthrown was, of course, by the Libyan Islamic fighting group, the Muqatila. And where was the Muqatila founded? Not in Cyrenaica, but in Afghanistan. And then it was only on coming back from Afghanistan that they waged their brutal guerrilla warfare from 1996 to 1999. So that legacy continues till today. Political and economically marginalized Cyrenaicans continue to try to overthrow the established order in their homeland by the only way they know how, seeking training abroad. Because in Libya, there aren't access to the military networks, nor the theological and institutional know-how. So the same impulses that drove Libyans to Afghanistan in the 1980s led them to Iraq in the 2000s and to Syria now. One way of looking at it is that Islamism became what I termed weaponized during the later Gaddafi period, and weaponized in the whole Libyan political discourse. And why did this happen? It shares parallels in places like Saddam's Iraq or Assad's Syria, but I think in Libya, the political space as we know it was the most closed of any Arab society. When I first went to live there in the late Gaddafi period in 2008, I felt like I was barely in an Arab country. It felt to me like North Korea. That's how closed the political space was. So this form of Jamahirian government, as Gaddafi termed it, depoliticized the country. It made political engagement illegal. As such, the mosque provided the only space for alternative political socialization. And with that as the case, Islamism was the best tool to engage in political and cultural activism. This trend, once set in motion, just like the Saudi funding that we've heard about, it propagates itself. It creates a cycle of political engagement. And therefore, it's outlasted the Gaddafi period. Even though, amazingly, you would go back to Libya in 2012, and we not only had NGOs and political parties, we had elections and a true blossoming, a very brief blossoming of civil society. But it didn't have the long-term, what you might call momentum of the political engagement that the Salafi incursion and the return of the jihadis began to inject into Libya in the 90s and 2000s. So that ends part one, and it's from these historic roots that I've tried to set out that the jihadism that led to ISIS was able to grow, and then for a while thrive in Libya. Part two. Since the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has occupied a constantly fluctuating position within the global jihad. In the wake of their liberation, Libyans often expressed sympathy and support for Syrians who they felt were still battling to depose their own repressive and violent dictator. And this empathy is something that I really have to stress and hasn't been covered enough in the media and the early academic histories of this period. Many things that happened in Syria were direct copies of the earlier militarized revolution in Libya. because they saw that the Egypt and Tunisia Arab Spring events, those were almost peaceful and didn't have a similar model. So just to toss a few things out there, when the fighting was going on, the Libyans made, of course, the National Transitional Council. The Syrians attempted, of course, to make a Syrian National Council. When the Libyan National Transitional Council, before they had toppled Gaddafi, began to seek recognition as Libya's sovereign government, a few weeks later, the Syrian National Council reached out. They didn't get anyone to recognize them as the Syrian sovereign government except for one, and that was the Libyans. So those ties between the Syrian and Libyan revolutionary Arab Spring moments really need to be stressed in understanding how ISIS and other jihadi groups have interconnected those regions even further. It's not a surprise then that as early as 2011, Libyan fighters who had just won the battles in, say, Tripoli or Beni Walid or Sirte said, the struggle is not over. Take me to Aleppo, Raqqa, Idlib. And what they did was initially they joined existing jihadi factions, but they said, you know what? Our real goals will be better served if we have uniquely Libyan units within the larger Syrian jihad. So we think of Nusra, of course, and then later the groups that became Daesh. All of them have uniquely Libyan units that are walled off. So for example, you might know the Abu Batar Brigade is a good example. So as this was happening in the kind of jihadi networking milieu, simultaneously the new Libyan state apparatus failed to consolidate those very institutions that were needed to create a post-Gaddafi state. And it also failed to ingratiate itself with the Libyan population. Difficult to see now, but you'll have to trust me, there was a honeymoon period from 2012 to 2013 where Libyans were willing to work with the National Transitional Council and then the General National Congress. That period is now gone. Even in that kind of optimistic state-building attempting period, Libya still lacked institutions. That was the legacy from Gaddafi's stateless state, Jamahiriya, destroy civil society. So even at that moment, just as Libyans were going to fight in Syria, Iraqis and those who'd fought in Afghanistan came to Libya as a place for relaxation and kind of resting in the global jihad. Over the course of 2014, as jihadi fighters from places that were not Libya progressively embedded themselves in Libya's key militias, another development took place. Libya's government fractured into two entities, each claiming legitimacy. This caused what you might call a civil war. And that took the jihadis who had been essentially quiescent. They had participated in the overthrow of Gaddafi, but they had not had their own agenda, per se, to exit their slumber, and they indirectly supported the Tripoli faction by waging a brutal war against all forces assigned and aligned with the Tobruk government and General Haftar. This anti-Haftar bloc and the military force Haftar subsequently used against what you might broadly term, or what he attempted to broadly term, terrorists, but was a range of political opponents such as some Misratans, some Muslim Brotherhood supporters. This dynamic backfired on Haftar. It's something that we've seen throughout the region. Look at any attempt to label your opponent as a terrorist. Well, you lump together all your opponents. Some of them are not terrorists, some of them are Islamists, some of them are not even Islamists. This created a common cause that had not existed in Libya between jihadis, some Islamists, and then just some anti-Haftar groups and areas. In fact, we could say it was Haftar's aggression, with Sisi's help, of course, which became the real rallying point for groups recruiting in Benghazi and Derna at the time. And this led to the discourse that funneled from Ansar al-Sharia into ISIS. So what emerged is something of a culture war. where the jihadists had been at the margins of the Arab Spring moment in Libya, all of a sudden, they were able to claim the mantle of the anti-Gaddafi revolution. Look, Haftar is a former general in Gaddafi's army. He's working with Sisi. Sisi is essentially the Mubarak regime reincarnated. This gave a lot of rhetorical ammunition to those on the Islamist side to say, the jihadis are our friends. The jihadis are fighting with us against Haftar, against Sisi. They are trying to complete the revolution. And that cultural dimension is something that we all understand has happened in Syria. The reason that Nusra, of course, means the support front, is that they claim to be supporting the larger non-Islamist goals of just getting rid of the Assad regime. On the other side, of course, Haftar was willing to lump all his enemies together, call them jihadis. What did this cause? Both groups were not able to govern. And therefore, at the local level, that's where all governance kind of got delegated in Libya. You had a stateless mess. Within this larger civil cultural war I've outlined, it's not an exaggeration to say that Libya became the ideal spot for the postgraduate training in jihad. Picture yourself a young North American man who went for your undergraduate degree to fight in Syria. What better than to return from Syria to take your graduate degree, where you didn't need to study under Nusra or ISIS, you could establish your own militia. And of course, as we know, when we get our graduate degrees, the point is to put your research into practice. And the rhetorical structures existed. The aim was to defeat the tyrant, the Taghut, Haftar, and to establish as many jihadi emirates as possible. Well, Libya provided ample opportunities for that, because there were ungoverned spaces like Darna, like Benghazi, like Sabrata. So in this period, 2014-2015, jihadi militias proliferated. And it was only natural that given the successes of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Syria and Iraq, there was a great attraction. And key commanders who had entirely been separate and had had nothing to do with ISIS in the Middle East began to express their allegiance and pledge it to Baghdadi. This initially led to the takeover by ISIS of Libya's only city which had been firmly controlled by the jihadis since Gaddafi's fall, Darna. Many people think that it was militias who came directly from Syria to Libya and conquered Darna. No, I'm trying to explain the opposite. Libya was a permissive environment for militias. Darna was the most permissive one for jihadis, most of whom were Libyans. Only later did they pledge allegiance. So Darna had curiously never integrated itself into the post-Gaddafi governance structures in the same way as other cities had. It was the only coastal city in which voting for the GNC was not able to take place due to the inability to secure polling places and deliver ballots. Cut off from all forms of central government assistance, the city was quickly overrun by extremist groups in 2012, who occupied the role that local councils were able to play elsewhere in Libya during this period. Initially in November 2014, the links of those in Libya who pledged allegiance to the Islamic State with the group's command centers in Mosul and Raqqa were quite loose. As I said, they were their own groups, they just pledged allegiance. But, because I've tried to explain a nexus, a kind of jihadi network, a jihadi globalization, over time, people flowed from Syria to Darna, Tripoli, and Benghazi. ISIS in Libya became something of a franchise, culturally imitating the key attributes of ISIS in the Levant. According to research conducted by my nonprofit, within weeks of Darna's jihadis pledging formal allegiance to ISIS, all of a sudden they received something of a welcome kit. And this welcome kit had training in how to make their social media presence look exactly like the ISIS presence in the Levant. Initially, they didn't have the ability to make those videos with, that waving black flag and to tweet in a certain way. Well, they got trained. So even if they weren't taking direct commands on military or administrative matters, they were gradually becoming more ISIS-like culturally. What did we see? We saw a wave of recruitment videos. Some were aimed directly at Tunisian foreign fighters, calling on them to come first to Libya as a stopping grounds before going to Tunisia. This meant that Libya's importance in jihadi propaganda was up a notch. It was preached that if things were reversed in the Middle East and the commanders had to flee Raqqa and Mosul, they could take safe haven in Libya. To gain traction for this, what you might call propaganda offensive, ISIS in Libya launched spectacular attacks, and they did so deliberately to make international headlines. In January 27, 2015, ISIS took responsibility for an attack on the Corinthia Hotel, the most famous hotel in Tripoli. The same month, ISIS fighters kidnapped Egyptian Coptic Christians, who they later beheaded. In March of 2015, ISIS attacked various oil fields. Now, despite the prevalence of jihadi fighters and institutions in Derna as the historic hub for where Libyans were exported to Iraq and Afghanistan, their presence there was always precarious because Derna had many different strands of jihadism. It had groups who'd come back from Afghanistan, the LIFG guys, and then Ansar Sharia. ISIS, in its attempt to rule, attacked prominent families and tribal leaders and Salafi leaders. This was designed to compel the population to be submissive, but it didn't work. It provoked Dernawis to flee their homes, and it provoked other jihadi groups who saw themselves as more moderate to oppose ISIS. This all came to a head in June of 2015 when ISIS killed two commanders of the rival jihadi group, the Derna Mujahideen Shura Council. Then, with local support, the DMSC was able to drive ISIS out of the center of the city within 1 month. Now, rather than losing its key commanders, ISIS made a strategy. Let's escape Derna and go set up a new headquarters in Sirte. So by the middle of 2015, ISIS had entirely captured Sirte. And that was very interesting when that happened because Sirte does not have a history of jihadism. In fact, quite the opposite. It doesn't have a history of any conservative Islamic activism. But what it did have was it had been the wealthiest and most privileged city under Gaddafi because it was his birthplace. And then it was humiliated by conquest and occupation in 2011. Sirte had never received governance or stability as part of the post-Gaddafi settlement. ISIS sought to provide it. And as I've said, there's this peculiarly Libyan hate of central government, but a desire for the services that it might provide. So to do that, ISIS tried to capitalize on the ongoing civic war inside Sirte, co-opting both Ansar Sharia elements and disgruntled tribes who had been affiliated with the Gaddafi regime, like the Magarha, the Warfalla, and the Qadhadifa. Drawing on these alliances and brutally suppressing their opponents, many groups pledged allegiance to ISIS, and the group had become the sole power in Sirte in 2015. And they instituted a truly novel state-like vision of jihadi governance, from imama to takfir, and sustained territorial control and taxes and laws and things like this. Once Sirte had become ISIS's headquarters by mid-2015, the group understood the Libyan populace and its needs enough to clean the streets, ensure that grocery stores were stocked. They even recruited doctors and engineers to come from Europe to help the new state function. And in a funny remark, the UN Special Envoy to Libya, Martin Kobler, said, prior to the assault on Sirte, ISIS, in fact, had the most well-run governance model of any group in Libya, i.e., more than the Tobruk or Tripoli authorities. But yet the same cycle that we saw in Derna in late 2014 has now been playing out in 2016 in Sirte. ISIS's penchant for excessive brutality and extractive governance proved too extreme and too alien, almost un-Libyan. And as a result, the residents of Sirte got fed up, just as the residents of Derna had done before them. ISIS would regularly target residents who they accused of being spies for the Misratan 166 Brigade. They subjected them to gruesome public executions, crucifixions, beheadings, and we're talking of Muslim inhabitants of Sirte. In mid-August 2015, the local residents of the Forjan tribe banded together and attempt to derail ISIS's control. Their Salafi preacher was killed. In response, they attacked ISIS. ISIS fighters then killed 40 Forjan members who had not been involved with this supposed uprising. They even targeted locals from other tribes, shelling all the houses in what's called the 3rd district of Sirte. They beheaded 12 others. As a result, the rebellion was initially crushed. But the population said, we're not going to live here. By the end of 2015, 90% of the population of Sirte had fled. ISIS's government had failed. It was on the verge of financial and what I would call cultural collapse. Its attempt to bring governance, the very governance that Libyans are needing and desiring, had failed. Therefore, Misratan-led militias, supported by US airstrikes, advanced on the city, quickly making gains from June-August 2016. Since then, the fighting has ground to a standstill over the last square kilometer of ISIS control. And that's where we are today. Throughout this process, then, Libya has acquired another degree of importance in global jihadi circles. Libya now is the case study of how jihadi groups can fail to govern territory, be defeated militarily, but then regroup and rebrand themselves. And I call this the transition backward. ISIS came from Ansar Sharia and Al-Qaeda, and now it's going back to the very state structures, the very anti-state, non-state structures from which it came. Study of this history shows that ISIS is a symptom of broader Libyan social problems. To defeat it, international and Libyan policy needs to treat root causes, especially weak governance. Therefore, there is no such thing as a purely military strategy to defeat ISIS. The tyranny exercised by Libyan militias is at the heart of Libya's instability for the past 5 years. It constituted a major contributing factor to the environment that attracted ISIS. My research group has drawn 4 bullet point conclusions. 1, brutality backfires. 2, statelessness created ISIS. 3, the necessity to decentralize authority. And that means that ISIS was allowed to thrive in vulnerable localities because the central government had not devolved power to the local level. And as I've explained, the local level didn't accept the central government. And the last point is that marginalization in Libyan society enabled ISIS. What that means is that ISIS has been able to exploit and seek refuge within communities that suffered, that were supposedly the losers of the overthrow of Gaddafi. Communities vulnerable to ISIS's exploitation have included these kind of pro-Gaddafi elements, as well as the more radical elements of the uprising militias. True national reconciliation and inclusiveness in Libya, especially between former Gaddafi actors and then anti-Gaddafi rebels, or between anti-Islamists and pro-Islamist actors, that's the only way to break the cycle and pattern of radicalization. This can be achieved by building in genuine reconciliation process to any new unity government, and I would hope into any new Libyan constitution. So in answer to the question posed by this panel, what is to be improved in the Arab world? My primary desire would be to change the prevailing cultural perception in Libya and elsewhere that politics is a zero-sum conflict for power, money, and influence that requires each town or tribe to fear people from far-flung regions as rivals for limited resources. We must prove that a positive-sum culture which embraces compromise can succeed. In Libya, we believe this can be achieved by empowering the local level to be the primary epicenter of governmental power, and therefore not having government be against Libyan culture. This bureaucratic shift, of course, requires a cultural shift. Libyans need to grapple with their long-standing ambivalent relationship towards governance and their ingrained distrust of outsiders who have different accents that they do, different accents and come from different regions than they do. However, given recent events in the Western world, we should all be able to empathize rather directly with this most human phenomenon of fearing outsiders. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jason, for this, I'd say, organical description of a certain jihadi globalization. And now we have time enough, at least a whole half an hour, to discuss and debate. If you want to participate in our debate, please raise your hand. I think we have extra microphones here. We have ready.
Hola, buenas tardes. Hola, buenas tardes. Voy a hacer la pregunta en español. Son dos. No sé mucho de Libia, pero siguiendo las noticias he visto un detalle. Se dice que el hijo de Gaddafi sigue vivo. Es decir, se había especulado que uno de los hijos estaba muerto, pero finalmente se descubrió que estaba vivo. Y se dice que él mismo pues, se le mantiene, digamos, como un actor, o que podría ser un actor, digamos, en una Libia menos desastrosa que la que vemos en la actualidad. La segunda pregunta, y también a raíz de las noticias, ¿cuál ha sido el papel de Arabia Saudita en la... Más o menos. Sí, la primera, viendo las noticias, encontré que uno de los hijos de Gaddafi había sobrevivido. Se había especulado de que había muerto, pero que finalmente había sobrevivido. Y uno de los comentarios que se hacía era de que se le mantenía vivo o se consideraba que podría ser parte, digamos, del futuro de Libia. Eso es lo primero. Para dar, digamos, cierto aspecto de estabilidad, según lo que había leído. Lo segundo, ¿cuál ha sido el papel de Arabia Saudita tanto en las revueltas contra Gaddafi como en la actualidad en dicho país?
More than one of Gaddafi's sons have survived. It's not only Saif al-Islam, but I believe you're probably referring to Saif al-Islam, who is sitting in detention in Zintan. He's not going to have any political power in Libya. That doesn't make any sense. He needs to be tried by the ICC according with the various statutes. It's true that the politics have shifted, and the Zintanis who were initially opposed to the Gaddafi regime and were one of the most important militias in the overthrowing of the Gaddafi regime are now aligned with the pro-Haftar current. So in a way, they have made their peace with the Gaddafi regime, and they support Saif al-Islam. In terms of the role of the sons in any future Libya, they are too stigmatized and too divisive as figures, and seen as, of course, corrupt. And Saif said famously on February 21st, 2011, that the rebels were merely rats and should all be exterminated. So I don't think he can have a role in any post-Gaddafi power-sharing arrangement. However, people who served in the Gaddafi regime but don't have blood on their hands, you know, the water ministers and education ministers and people with technocratic know-how, they have to be allowed to participate. So the idea of having a full-scale, what's called lustration, that's not feasible. On the question of the role of the Saudis in supporting events in Libya, this is a very interesting and under-researched question. We know a lot about the role of Qatar, of course. The Qataris were probably the most important. I believe that without their support, we wouldn't have had the success of the rebel movement. And then on the other hand, we know about the Emirates in Egypt, right? Roughly the Qataris and Turks support the Misratans and Muslim Brotherhood aligned groups, while the Emirates and Egypt support initially Zintan and other now Haftar-aligned groups in the east and anti-Islamist groups. Now, to tie this back into James's paper before we hear from him, when I was hearing your presentation of the power of Saudi, public relations and soft power abroad, I was wondering if you were going to say their desire to destroy, not defeat, but destroy the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region. And I think that this is the key, is that the Saudis have a zero-sum view, which is that the Muslim Brotherhood and some strands are their dead-set enemies. So the Emiratis, the Egyptians under Sisi, and the Saudis have exported that struggle. And the thought was, if we can prevent the Brotherhood from coming to power in Libya, we can then prevent the Brotherhood and Morsi supporters from challenging Sisi and trickling back into our region. I look at it as something of a Cold War, right? Malcolm Kerr spoke in the 1970s about a Cold War in the Arab world between Baathists and Nasserists and monarchists. Now we have a Cold War between roughly these Muslim Brotherhood types on the one hand and other Islamists, and this Saudi Emirati-backed bloc that's in bed with Sisi and other repressive autocrats. But I'm sure James has a different take. That's my very Libya-focused view.
Just one remark before I go on to the Brotherhood with regard to Saudi Arabia and Libya. The Saudi relationship with Libya was very troubled. The Saudis blame or accused Gaddafi of an attempt to assassinate or to kill King Abdullah. And of course, from a Saudi perspective, Libya was a revolutionary regime, and therefore there were fundamental differences. I think that I beg to disagree with you on the relationship between the Saudis and the Brotherhood. I think it's much more complex. One, the history of the Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia goes way back, and the Brotherhood is in many ways deeply ingrained into Saudi society. That is not to say that factions of the ruling family have long been, think of Prince Nayef when he was alive, who have long felt that the Brotherhood was at the source of a lot of their problems. The Saudis and the Emiratis do not see eye to eye on many issues, and in fact there's growing divergence. The history of why the Saudis turned on the Brotherhood was really an Emirati move, and it was Mohammed bin Zayed for whom the Brotherhood is a red cloth on a bull. At a time that King Abdullah's span of attention was 2 hours. And ultimately, when the battle for power, as Abdullah was dying and then passed away, was waged, Mohammed bin Zayed lost on that. And what you've seen since the rise of the Salmans is not a return to the status ante quo, but certainly a softening of the line. There have been instances where the Muslim Brotherhood has been back in the kingdom. It also has to do with Saudi-Qatari relations, post-Hamad, the former emir. And so I don't think what you have is a civilizational war between the Saudis and the Brotherhood. I think it's much more complex, certainly since the death of Abdullah.
Thank you. We have a second comment or question. Tomás.
Sí, muy brillante disertación. Y entonces yo creo que ha puesto usted el dedo en la llaga, que es el tema de la relación con las tribus. Bueno, la idea es que el Estado libio no pudo organizarse porque no pudo aglutinar las tribus. También pienso en un momento determinado la importancia de las tribus en Irak, durante incluso en la época del rey Saddam Hussein, que en un momento determinado, después de la Primera Guerra, llega ya a unos pactos con las tribus sunitas, se cambia, si se acuerdan ustedes, se cambia la bandera, porque ya se pone Allahu Akbar en la franja de en medio después de la Primera Guerra. La pregunta concreta es si usted puede explicar, ante todo, es que sobre todo la gente del Daesh que actúa en Libia pertenece a alguna tribu determinada, y si puede usted también desarrollar más un poco este tema de cómo el tribalismo en Libia y en general en también otros países árabes como Irak y Siria es posiblemente, como decimos en español, el caldo de cultivo del Daesh.
Thank you. I'll return the compliment. Yes, this is a very insightful question. Obviously, there's a connection between tribal cleavages and the groups that are more likely to be radicalized. One way of looking at what's happened in Libya since 2011 is, although Gaddafi operated a stateless state, it still had some institutions. You know, the universities kind of worked, the National Oil Company worked. And with the collapse of all those institutions, people have gone back to their primordial identities. And that means the tribe and the locality. Roughly put, there are two ways of answering your question, two opposing viewpoints, just as we have opposing viewpoints about the role of the Saudis and the Muslim Brotherhood. And rather than saying my viewpoint, I'll present both of them and not let you know which I think. So there's the one viewpoint that believes that the traditional, what are called Sada tribes, are a bulwark of anti-Islamist sentiment in the country. So by the Sada tribes, I mean the ones in Cyrenaica who are traditionally connected with the Sanusi Sufi order. Maybe the name Barasa, Ubaidat means something to you. And in that thesis, this is a thesis frequently associated with Joe Walker Cousins, if the name means anything. It's that tribes of the second tier, the Murabitin tribes, or tribes that are connected to Berbers, or the Berbers, meaning the Amazigh themselves in Jabal Nafusa, they've lost out. They don't have the same connection to the winners of the Libyan revolution. So those are areas where you find more Islamism and more jihadi recruitment. That is a thesis. I'm not saying right or wrong. Now I'll present a converse thesis. The other thesis about the role of tribalism and Daesh is that the tribes have asserted themselves to say they are strong. Look, we can govern our area. The Warfallah now govern Beni Walid, and we can have the elders. But that way of doing politics doesn't appeal to the younger generation. That tribalism is something for people over 60. This is a thesis, and therefore the average young Libyan feels left out. He wanted the revolution to continue. In other words, to purge all the old structures, be it Gaddafi officials, be it those tribal old guys. And they're like, well, we've got no alternative. But the jihadis are young and dynamic. A fascinating study has just been released showing that the average age of returnee fighters from Syria and Iraq to Libya is between 21 and 25. So that means that these guys were between 18 and 22 when they were going to fight in Syria. So this is a younger generation of very disaffected youth who are maybe outside of the tribal system entirely. They are what we might call marginalized. And therefore, ISIS tries to pretend that it is a tribe. It's like a new tribe to collect people together. I could talk about this for too long, so I'll stop and we'll take the next question.
Hola, buenas tardes. Lo primero, darles las gracias por las exposiciones. Y luego la pregunta, es una doble pregunta. Primero, si cree que se pueden establecer algún paralelismo entre el desarrollo de la guerra civil en Libia y el de la guerra civil en Somalia. Y segundo, si fuera así, si se puede extraer alguna enseñanza del proceso somalí aplicable al proceso libio. Gracias.
Okay. This is something that was always a bugaboo. When the revolution was happening, those people who opposed the NATO no-fly zone, that was not me, but those who did said, don't do it, don't overthrow Gaddafi, you'll get a Somalia on the Mediterranean. To which I said, well, that's a pretty bad analogy because Libya is wealthy and Somalia is fairly poor. The Libyans are Arabs of this kind and that kind, and they've got these cleavages, and the Somalis are entirely different. However, many kind of newspaper-level pundits or TV-level pundits have said, well, we were right the whole time. Look, Libya has become Somalia on the Mediterranean. I don't really think that's true because, one, there's no piracy in Libya. As much as there are attacks, the Libyans don't have a desire to menace international shipping. In terms of the peace process, that what can we learn from what's gone on in Somalia in terms of Libya, I think the only lesson there is that groups want governance, just tying into my talk, that the reason that you would accept al-Shabaab as brutal and corrupt and all that they were is that you wanted the kids to have peace enough to go to school. And for a brief period of time, various jihadi groups in Darna and Benghazi and Sabrata have provided that. But I don't think that the ISIS model has an attraction in Libya. You may be aware that in February of this year, the Americans made a bombing to catch a key Tunisian jihadi commander in Sabrata. They killed him. And the reaction was that secret ISIS cells came out of Sabrata and took over the town center. And of course, all the media loves to talk about the American attack. What they didn't talk about was, in the wake of that attack, all of the local councils banded together. They put aside their grievances and they defeated ISIS. It didn't require any outside interjection. So the Libyan body politic is compared by my good friend Nate Mason, who was the commercial attaché to the embassy in Tripoli when I was there. He says that the Libyan body politic has been infiltrated by a virus. The virus is the jihadis. Because all the tribes were against each other and there was no local governance, it was like you've just gone through a lot of jet lag and you're me, so the virus can come in very quickly and grow in your society. But then the antibodies come. Once you've gotten a good rest, the virus shows how awful it is, and the antibodies are building up. And I think that the antibodies have built up at the local level when it comes to ISIS. And that's why I said brutality backfires, and that the Libyan body politic now has its eyes and ears open and is ready to close ranks against these jihadis. In terms of the political, what should be done to learn from the Somalia lesson, I will direct you to Stig Hansen. Maybe you know him, the great Norwegian expert. I believe he's the greatest expert of the Shabab and of the process to cure the Somali civil war. And he's written a little bit about what could be learned, what the lessons learned are. I'm not enough of an expert on Somalia to say anymore.
Just a couple of remarks and a question. I mean, I think one is, what Jason was just describing in terms of the turn against jihadism. You're seeing that in Somalia too. I'm not sure that piracy is the yardstick. If anything, I think what one sees is in both of these situations is the rise of criminal networks, whether that is piracy, human trafficking, whatever it may be. I actually have a question, if I may, for Jason.
Sure.
Which was the study that you referred to in terms of the, and I'd be curious to know what it said about what the aspirations of those were that returning.
Sure.
particularly because if you look at the generation of 2011, if you want to call that, a lot of that generation are apathetic today. They're disaffected, they're disappointed, they no longer see engagement as worthwhile. Now, the fringe of that has radicalized, but it's been the fringe of it, not the mass of it. So I'm not sure that, without more, how to judge the study.
Okay. So I was referring to a paper with the New America Foundation by Nate Rosenblatt, and he's not well known, but he's the husband of Lydia Sizer, who's a reasonably serious Libya expert. And we don't know the motivations of any of these individuals. This is, shooting in the dark. Jihadis are a dark box. They don't tell you their direct motivations. It comes from captured documents, though, captured ISIS documents. In a way, some people are calling this the new Sinjar records, right? And what we learned from the Sinjar records in 2006 was the birthplace and origin of many of the jihadis who were fighting in Iraq. And that's how we knew the shocking statistic that Derna represented something like 25% of all the non-Iraqi and non-Saudis fighting in Iraq. And that was shocking because Derna is a small city. So I'm not sure if I fully got the question here. Yes, we don't know their motivations. We just have yet another name list. And this name list, though, is taswir of the passports. So we know when they're born and their birthplace cities. And what that has given is the sense of, in a way, going back to the issue of tribal networks. I don't like to look at it as tribal networks, but rather familial networks. If your father was a jihadi or your uncle was killed fighting in Afghanistan, you're more likely to be pulled into that milieu. And people who know the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is going to make perfect sense. If your uncle was in an Israeli prison, it's well known that your whole larger family is likely to be pulled into Palestinian activism. So that's what these records show, is what you might call intergenerational transmission of jihadi networks. I'm not, as I said, an expert on what can be learned from those detailed records, except that transmission is happening. We have something like, there was a communist international, we have a jihadi international of ideological and social transposition, kind of inheritance.
Any other question or remarks?
My question is about both Libya and Iraq. What do you think has been the role of the armies that existed in Iraq before the invasion and in Libya in the development of events afterwards, particularly in the development of jihad? There were large numbers of trained soldiers and officers. What role did they play, if any? Thank you.
I'll go first and then I'll let you go. So there's frequently an analogy made from the fact that ISIS had its base in Iraq in the Sunni heartlands of the Saddam regime, Anbar province, and that ISIS got its main headquarters in Libya in the heartlands of the Gaddafi regime, Sirte, and the Sirtican Basin. And then, although that is 100% true, people then jump to an incorrect statement, which is that therefore there must be former Gaddafi army officers who are working in Sirte with ISIS, because it is true that former Saddam army officers are into Crete or were into Crete. So the Iraqi case is not the Libyan case, sorry. In Iraq, yes, part of the military doctrine, and I could direct you to a paper by Barak Barfi in the Counterterrorism Sentinel. The military doctrine of ISIS in Iraq has a lot to do with Ba'athist military doctrine of, a frontal assault and then whatever. And they happen to use a suicide bomber for the frontal assault, but these are top commanders who gave a lot of military learning to ISIS in Iraq, not in Libya. All the former Libyan army guys are fighting with Haftar. Or they're fighting with, maybe you've heard of the Kaka Brigade in Zintan. For whatever reason, even though ISIS is in Sirte and is in some of the heartlands of former Gaddafi military people. It's not them. It's the jihadi networks that I was describing, and then returnees. And Tunisians are really important. Like the middle management level of ISIS in Libya is almost exclusively Tunisians.
Just to add to that, I mean, there are two probably major differences between Iraq and Libya. One is that you had within the Ba'athist political structure, as well as within the military, a move towards more political Islam already under Saddam, which you didn't have in that way under Gaddafi. And of course, you didn't have the disbandment of the military in the way you had in Libya, in the way that you had that by the U.S. occupation administration post 2003.
Actually, I should have said, I assumed a basic knowledge of the fact that Libya barely had an army, whereas Iraq had a huge one. I should have opened with that. Gaddafi was so afraid of any army that might overthrow him, because he himself was an army officer who overthrew the Senussi monarchy. He gutted the army. The official army was so weak it could barely do anything to repress the revolution. He had to rely entirely on informal brigades like the 32nd or Khamis Brigade.
Any other intervention? Listening to your sharp and thought-provoking commentaries, I was recalling what Mr. Moratino said this very morning about the Sykes-Picot secret agreements that it's going to turn 1 century precisely next year. And I was wondering what in these secret agreements is, I mean, in the backstage of those agreements, they are always dealing with this tribal description, this tribal distribution of the Arab world. So they are mistrusting the very concept of state in the Arab world because they are focusing on a distribution of tribes. And I was wondering that if this can be true at that time, I mean 1 century ago, and if this can be true today. I mean, if we have to look at the Arab world, at the MENA region, as an ensemble of tribes, or we may trust in the very concept of state?
Well, one, I don't think that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was looking at the Arab world as a collection of tribes. I'm going to fundamentally disagree with that. I think it was looking at the Arab world as a collection of areas of British, French, and Russian influence. It's already had its 100th anniversary. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, so maybe, yeah. No, it was not a tribal-based system. If it was a tribal-based system, you wouldn't have the border between Syria and Iraq in the way that it is. It actually cuts tribes in half. And of course, the Syrian-Iraqi border isn't Sykes-Picot anyway. It's San Remo. So all this talk about Sykes-Picot is always misplaced in my view. In terms of today, I don't think that tribes are that important throughout the Middle East. They're important in Libya. That's, just to be clear, I don't want to generalize. Egypt, there are barely any tribes. I mean, yes, there's 1 or 2 in the Saada, in the south. But it's precisely that the role of tribes has decreased in the Arab world over the last 100 years that makes their resurgence in Libya an exception. And that Libya is neo-primordial, if that makes sense.
If I could just add.
Just one remark, but I was thinking about the idea, the very idea of Winston Churchill about these tribes, not these countries. I mean, I perfectly know that they are dividing between interests and, of England and of France, but the consideration of mistrusting the very concept of a state in the Arab world. I mean, do we think in European chancelleries that we have to respect the frontiers?
Wow, I think I see it very differently than you. In fact, it was in the classical World War I period that rather than mistrusting the state, they thought the state would be the answer to all problems. If we could only bring Westphalianism to the Middle East, we would sort out this region. And sadly, that view has persisted, right? One of the tragedies in the Libya conflict is that whether it's European actors or UN actors, or to some extent even the Gulfies, they only deal with the guy who is the head of the ministry or the elected whatever. which doesn't have any power in Libya. It's the militia leader or the local council guy. So there's too much of a reliance on state structures. The tribe is not considered in Foggy Bottom and in Whitehall, and nor is the local leader, because it's not really tribes. In Misrata, it's the local, the local council and the militia leaders, which are so powerful. So quite the opposite, that we don't live in a society where ethnographs make Middle Eastern policy. We live in one where technocrats and bureaucrats make Middle Eastern policy, and they say, aha, I am the minister of this. I need to speak to the Libyan minister of educational programs. Okay, here is this pot of money. Please spend it on educational programs. It turns out that guy has no power at all and can't even spend the money. But it would work if you would go to the local level and meet the head of the Misratan local council or the Sabha local council. So I don't see Western diplomats as grasping the local complexity. Hence my advice of one thing we should do if we're trying to have a more nuanced view of the region is to work at the local level, because that's where policy and interlocutors can be found.
I just want to add two things. One is, Sykes-Picot and various other colonial drawings of borders were not tribally based.
Yeah.
They were totally artificial.
Exactly.
And in fact, if you were to read them in a tribal sense, then they made no sense whatsoever. But I think more importantly, a lot of the discussion, not necessarily here, but in general over the Middle Eastern tribes, is a very static discussion, as if tribes had not developed, as if what members of tribes, particularly in countries with a huge youth bulge, expect from their tribal leaders has changed. And therefore, the tribes in some countries still do exist, in Libya, Saudi Arabia, other places, but their role is a very different role. So we're not talking about tribes of 100 years ago. These like everybody else, have moved into a modern age.
Couldn't agree more.
Tomás? I can see very clearly. I don't know if you raised your hand there.
If you want, I'd love to ask you a question.
Okay.
Tengo algo que decir. No estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que está diciendo la mesa, porque, por ejemplo, en el caso concreto de Siria, saben ustedes que hay una cosa que se llama la asabía, lo pronuncio mal en árabe, que es precisamente el espíritu tribal que está en el fondo del poder alawita de la familia de los Assad. Concretamente podría ser también otra familia. Discrepo un poco de que las tribus no tienen importancia. Yo creo que evidentemente el basismo, el naserismo, la Nahda, el renacimiento árabe, que es lo que se está produciendo después de la distribución de territorios, iba por otro camino, pero creo que el espíritu tribal, por ejemplo, concretamente ahora en el caso de Siria, a través de lo que se ha estudiado muy bien, lo pueden ustedes ver en 20.000 libros, el espíritu de la asabía, es decir, el espíritu en el fondo tribal o del mundo tribal, a mi modo de ver, está todavía muy vigente.
Well, this is a discourse that we hear a lot. But to just support James's point, even if there's a quote-unquote tribal spirit or an asabiya, it doesn't play out in a traditional tribal structure if that ever existed. And I want to point out that we've got some philologists here. When Ibn Khaldun talks about asabiya, he talks about it as something which can come from a family, from a clan, from a tribe, or from a new social organization. So you can get asabiya for any kind of movement, right? So to throw it back at you, in Syria, you've got lots of new kinds of asabiya, where local areas have had to bond together, face the Assad regime, create structures, for example, that make sure that people get food in their neighborhood, and pool together resources. They create a new asabiya for fighting Assad. It's not the same static, pretend I have an eponymous ancestor, therefore we're all of the same tribe. And what I was speaking about in Libya is really neo-tribalism, but I didn't want to get too academic. I mean, I can direct you to Wolfram Lacher here. Yes, asabiya is tremendously at play, and there is a going back on primordial identities, but nothing is ever the same, nothing is static. The way that that expresses itself and who leads those movements is entirely new. So instead of having some sheikh who's got a gray beard, these days the asabiya tends to coalesce around a militia commander. And it's the militia commanders, both in the jihadi milieu, but even just in the regular who governs in this Libyan town, right? It's a militia guarding Melita, where the gas stream, green stream pipeline of gas comes, and people have a reverence for him as if he was a, you know, almost a tribal leader. But it's a new structure. So asabiya can work into new structures.
Okay, thank you very much. So if you don't mind, we are going to stop here. Thank you very much to both of you.